Hey, Benny, how's it going?
Good, good. Thanks yourself.
Doing fantastic. So, yeah, I think before the show we were just talking about uh, kind of relaxation in the corporate world with titles and everything else. So on LinkedIn, I think you're called Clive, and now you're but also Benny. So,
Yeah, yeah. The professional world has become a lot more relaxed, so we can get away with nicknames now. Whereas I don't know, when I started work, it was all ties and seriousness, and ties have gone, and
mm,
now nicknames can manage as well.
you can get a tie with your nickname on it too.
I can't remember the last time I wore a tie. I'm glad they went.
I'm the same. Yeah, I think I've worn I don't know. I think I had a job where I had to wear one once, but it was I don't know. They're kind of weird. Like I don't know the point of them. I don't know the history of ties and like why we started wearing them in the first place. But I don't know.
Yeah, they don't
So
really serve a function, do they? Yeah, it's a good point.
I mean, you can wipe your face with them, I guess, or something. But if you, but or blow your nose into them. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so on that fun note, for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Benny Benford. I'm doing my own thing now. My background, I used to be a consultant for a while. Worked in kind of the big four. That's where I got into data. Then I went to
Yeah,
Jaguar Land Rover for 6 years. Was
nice,
chief data officer there,
nice.
and then was it now about 6 months ago? Moved on from that, mostly to take a career break because I became a dad. And
Oh, congrats.
thank you. As some friends joked, I went from chief data officer to chief daddy officer.
Mm.
Um, it's more of a full-time job, and I'm now working on a startup. So I'm doing a bit of my own consulting work to pay my way, whilst working on a couple of different things in the background.
Okay, so which CDO job do you find more challenging? And then the next question is, what job do you find more rewarding?
I mean, so the second question's easy. The
Right, like
chief
softball.
daddy officer is more rewarding. What's more challenging? I actually think my now 9 month old son is more rational than organizations. So I found chief data officer more challenging.
Oh wow, we'll get into
It's
that. I'm very curious. So, yeah, that's interesting.
got to be
What's
careful
it?
what I say there, but before I start
No.
comparing,
I mean,
well,
hey,
yeah,
it's a big organization. I could be talking about anybody, right?
yeah, yeah.
But that is an interesting kind of dropping off point into the conversation. You were chief data officer or chief, I'd say a very prestigious company, and dropping off to do a startup. Like, what's that journey like? Like, what was the kind of the mindset shift that you went through?
Um, I always had frustrations about gaps that I saw on the data world and the data market. And I thought for about 5 years about starting to go and maybe address some of them. But I don't have that higher risk appetite, and I wanted to learn, and I wanted to have kind of been there and done it first. So I was really keen to at least scale a transformation to proper enterprise level board remit, pushing through a series of changes. And that actually showed me even more gaps. I'm convinced that it's actually there's a whole series of services missing to support companies to run a proper data transformation at the moment. The consultancies, in my mind, are conflicted. In a simple
Mm,
analogy, they would rather, the classic analogy, do you want someone to teach you to fish or sell you fish? They would rather sell fish. They'd rather sell you data services than get you self-sufficient. Whereas a data transformation should be getting a company that's got its own innovation and agility to kind of do whatever it needs, and no one's really helping to do that. So yeah, some frustrations. Always wanted to try and do my own thing, but I wanted to get the experience practically first before going and doing something different.
it's a big jump, right? Like, especially if
Yes.
you're at a big company, like from going to all the organizational support you have, especially as a C level, right, to going to a probably a one person show or much smaller gig. It's
I mean, that way round, that's been a big jolt, a big reminder of. So I'm one of my skill sets. I'm an innovator. I'm good at coming up with ideas, and I guess not quite this crass, but the way I experienced things once I started working and stopped doing just being a dad. I was like, I've got all these ideas, but there's less progress. Why is that? My team used to go and drive the actions, and suddenly
Right.
just coming up with ideas doesn't do it anymore. So yeah, I've had to relearn. Spend a lot of time actually focusing on just building my own systems at the moment. I'm
Mm,
in no hurry to run into to fully kind of bringing products and services to market, which is why I'm doing consulting to pay my way, but really building up my own operating system. So studying the basics. I've just done a writing course,
nice.
doing some building up my note taking skills, all of those things, so you can have a much better operating system yourself.
It's a really smart way of going about it. I think a lot of the mistakes I've seen, you know, I guess entrepreneurs make, including myself, is just jump in, start solving the problem. But you're talking about processes and systems or things that are
Yeah,
those are two like really rare words that people don't usually, utter when they're starting out. Because it's like, oh, I gotta go make money. I gotta go, go hustle or something, right? And so that's definitely an enlightened view. Have you read like books like the E Myth or similar types of tomes?
I haven't read that book. I did a focus course last year, which was really good, and that focused a lot on building your systems and looking at what causes of burnout are. And I was definitely
Mm,
close to burnout when I left. It's a really simple system that they've got. They talk about there being 4 steps to have a good operating model. You need a vision, you need some form of planning system, you need some system for doing things, and then you need to celebrate. And if you lose any one of those, and typically the one people forget is celebrate, then you plan big, you break it down, you do, and you're straight back to planning big, and you burn out. But so I've spent that taught me what I was missing was celebration. So I've spent a lot of time
mm,
making sure I build in small celebrations to life. These sound ridiculous things, but whenever I publish an article now, I read an episode of Sandman. It's just a bit of fun, right? So, but it's the idea that whenever you do a big task, you don't just rush into the next thing. You step
hmm.
back, and then part of this I also learned the hard way. We met on LinkedIn. I didn't do that much on social when I was in the corporate world, and I started picking up this year. I found it overwhelming, and that
Mm.
really taught me that in order to, because I really want to stay in that world and build my network and communities and brand and everything else, but you need a system to do it. Otherwise, it can easily become overwhelming.
Oh yeah, I think it's an interesting one too because I feel like you need to build the systems until it becomes sort of like a second nature.
Yeah.
I don't know if like a reflex is maybe the right word, but um, yeah, like I've been on LinkedIn for so long, and at first it felt awkward, but now it's just like and it's interesting too when you see what content does really well. Like I just post like the dumbest crap on LinkedIn. Like there's no thought to it whatsoever. And typically it's like the dumbest post, but those tend to do really well, right? Like on
Yeah.
paper, you'd be like, you think that the thoughtful post, the quote thought leadership post would do really well, but it's like not at all. It's like me hanging out with a bunch of sixth graders. That does really well. Talking about AI and stuff, and like just stuff that you're just like it doesn't fit like the professional mark or whatever, right? But I think to an earlier point too, when we first started talking, it's like I think people's expectations of what what good content is, or I don't know, professional content has changed a lot. So
And
it's
I found at the beginning, succeeding was disruptive in a weird way. So if you had a
mm,
post that did take off, suddenly I felt, I need to be there. I need to reply to everything. And that's
mm,
chaos because you don't know when that happens. You've got, as you say, there's a amount of unpredictability about it. Certainly when you're learning, the smaller things that
yeah.
you've done in 5 to 10 minutes go crazy. Some things you put a lot of effort into go nowhere. And the first time I had a post which went completely nuts, I practically lost all of my planning for the next 2 days. Whereas in reality, you should just be comfortable to go. It's fine if I don't respond to all of this. And that takes time to build that up and to accept that you time box all of these things. And if you can't get
Oh
around to things, you
yeah.
can't get around to things.
Oh, it can eat you alive.
Yeah.
The strategy. I know a lot of influencers who they'll measure everything, like every impression, everything about it. But I'm more taking the approach now of kind of ghost and post. So maybe like reply to the first few comments, like it and stuff, just to get it some traction with the algorithm. But after that, if it takes on a life of its own, I actually mute some posts that I write
Oh,
that go
really?
popular. Yeah, because I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to see it. I'm just
That's
like, whatever
interesting.
happens. Yeah, because it's going to consume so much mental bandwidth, and you're sometimes better off just saying like, nah, we're good.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That I might start doing that actually. Thank you. I've wondered what to do with. I mean, you see people comment on something you've written a week, 2 weeks ago, and you can't possibly keep track of that many threads. And
Nah.
it's
And there's some idiotic stuff people will post, to be frank, with comments, right? I mean,
yes,
it's just par for the course. It's just a law of averages. Like some will be good, some will be like absolutely like rubbish, and but the rubbish ones sometimes they can definitely get at you. I mean, it's not like we're just robots looking at the post and like you're not getting emotional. Like you said you spent 2 days like getting consumed by this stuff. It's like it is what it is. So but there's some haters out there, and there's some great people too. So.
Yeah, and that's hence that like if you find your own means of getting a celebration and just get the process, then everything else is background noise. Writing, I've actually found this was completely unexpected, but as I really got into writing, I was expecting it to help on the professional side. There's a whole bunch of ideas that I've never been able to frame well, and it's definitely helping with that. But it helps massively on the mental health and personal side as well. You suddenly, in the evenings, I try to write in the evenings, and then have both now unexpectedly personally, but also kind of professionally, so I've got a backlog of different things that I'm working on. But I end up finding some evenings just almost journaling, and it's a really good, reflective process. Particularly, I find one of the things I miss about being in a team environment. I found learning agile and retrospectives to be one of the most game-changing things in my career. That every 2 weeks as a team, how did we do? How do we learn? All of that feedback process just puts you on such a fast learning curve. But when you're an individual, you lose that retrospective and bouncing ideas off people and how are things going. And journaling from writing reintroduces some elements of that.
For sure. Yeah, because especially more than ever when you're alone, it's like you have to keep like sharpening the saw, as they say, right? And I've always found writing to be there's nothing that compares to it really in terms of sharpening your thinking around a topic, and being articulate about a subject matter, right? I mean, it's one thing to walk around and think about it all day, but the act of writing, it's a very clarifying exercise, and sometimes it's hard, right? Like, I'm sure you found spots where you're just like, I don't know what to write right now. It's like,
yeah, and succinctness. I'm without being boastful, aware of my skills, I'm reasonably good at public speaking and always got good feedback on conferences and that kind of thing. So I thought I would find it much easier because I said, well, it's, I've been up on stage sometimes at very short notice, spoken about a topic. I can think of the same topic and I'll just write it down. And you realize that the way that you speak, I mean, if someone took a transcription of what we were doing right now, it would be awful. So when you're trying to write it down, it needs to be more condensed. It needs a little bit of flow to it. Things that to make up for the fact that when you're speaking, you can add in tone, you can speed down, all of those things you lose on the page. So you just have to find other ways to make it appealing and succinct. And yeah, there's plenty of times I've written something and thought, that's really not what I meant. but
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have a Substack now. I mean, I'm checking out one article now, which we can talk about. Actually, the topic is really interesting, right? So the for the audience, it's titled "Elevating Data to a Profession: Why It Matters." Right. So the Substack is called "Data with Intent." Definitely go check it out and smash the subscribe button on it. But yeah, walk me through this article. I think it's interesting. I mean, it talks about. I guess the gist of it is data a real profession or not? And if not, then what can we do to get there?
Yeah, it's the language is confusing. I mean, English is not is a prescriptive and well-defined thing, but it's my eyes, it's not a profession in the same way that medicine or law or teaching or accounting is. For those areas, if you want to go into them, you get a broad foundational knowledge base, and then you specialize. And that broad foundational knowledge base includes concepts of ethics, of professional principles, of the regulations in your field. And then the observation, as happens, I started my career as an accountant, so I went through one of those. And it meant that as an accountant, I could jump between all of the different professions, between corporate finance, between tax, etc. My experience in data is we miss a lot of that. The data governance teams that I've worked with didn't necessarily have a good understanding of data engineering, which is kind of weird because if you want to govern your data well, it's now heavily done in the code level and within data engineering, and it's hard for the teams to communicate. But likewise, the data engineers didn't necessarily have a good idea of governance. Very few teams had, or very few individuals had any training in data ethics and any training in regulations beyond GDPR. And so we've got, for sure, lots of very specialist trades, and there are routes where you can go very deep, with all of the routes, whether people have the computer science knowledge within data engineering, have a statistical knowledge in data science, whatever it is. But we lack that ability for the different specialisms to integrate in a seamless way. And I find that a productivity concern within data teams for sure, but also a growing risk now that if we go back 20 years, data was really there to keep IT systems running by and large. Now data is automating how we make decisions in social environments. It's creating algorithms which influence our lives. It's got a lot more social responsibility than it used to. And therefore, I think there's an obligation on people working in the area to start to have more of an understanding on the consequences of what they do. And we don't have those things today.
That's interesting.
What do you think?
I have two conflicting ideas in this. One, I was just talking to one of my friends, and she asked what I thought about data. And so on one hand, it's a classic being able to hold two conflicting opinions in your mind at once. So on one hand, I wish that the way we talk about data would almost go away, right? What I mean by this is focus on the business functions, and maybe if data can help enable that, terrific. But on one hand, I feel like we take data, we're placing it on a pedestal for some reason, and part of me is like, why? Maybe we put the business function on the pedestal and then figure out how we can use data to serve that. So that's one opinion. On the other hand, I completely agree with the need to have. I don't know if it's standardization or something like that, but okay, so I hire a data scientist. First of all, what the hell is a data scientist?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. If I were to try and define it, I can ask ChatGPT to define it for me, I guess, right? That's one way to do it. So I don't think there is not a consensus on what data science means. There was never a consensus. It wasn't supposed to be defined. Right. But it's a term we bandy about all the time. And it's supposedly a discipline that we all use. And so it's confusing. And for the business too, it's like, well, I hear data is, quote, the new oil. I hear data science like the sexiest job of the 21st century. I hear AI is awesome. And so, but when you go and build a data team, right, it's an utterly confusing task for a lot of companies. It's like, what exactly are we building? And so that's. And what are the roles we need? And like, how do I know that these people know their roles and all this stuff? And as data people too, it's like when we talk, I hope we're using the same words. You pointed out the English language is can be very fuzzy sometimes, right? But I think it speaks to the immaturity of the field. And I do hope that at least we can come to a consensus on, what's a minimum set of qualifications that you would need, or a minimum sort of knowledge you need to operate in this field. It's going to help everybody. So I don't know.
I like those, you say, ability to have two conflicting opinions, because I agree with both of what you've just said, but maybe they're related. If you know a discipline really well, you don't really speak about the mechanics anymore, whatever the discipline is. You don't hear, just take it away from the business area because it gets very dry. You don't hear sports people talking about all of the fundamental mechanics of how they're doing sport. Right. They talk about actually executing and strategy maybe a little bit. The profession that I came from, accounting, I don't know people spend much time talking about accounting and debits and credits, but we talk about the business. So maybe the fact that it's because they've been through that foundation. So now they can just focus on what they need to do. Maybe data people haven't. And I'm talking about posts, one of the posts that got the most traction, I said, I feel a bit weird sometimes saying I'm a data leader because I know I've got loads of knowledge gaps that make me feel a little bit uncomfortable about saying I'm a data leader. And I don't know if you feel the same, but a lot of people reply to say ditto. And it's maybe that's why we lack a foundational training course that gives us comfort to even name what the foundational areas are. I mean, fully aware of the irony of what I'm about to say on a call with Joe Rice. Data engineering is one of my weakest spots within data. So I'm aware of that. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have so many weak spots. It's not even funny. I mean, you asked me about data governance. I have an idea, but I'm probably going to get it wrong, and
Yeah.
data management. I have a book that's written by Dama sitting on my shelf. That doesn't make me a data management expert by any means. I've read it. That still doesn't mean I'm like, know what I'm doing in that area. But the thing is, when you say data leader, it's an interesting title or term, or I'm not sure exactly what it would mean, but it's like it kind of presumes that you have this all-encompassing knowledge of data, perhaps, right? And I'm not going to say that I have that. You said you don't, and so I don't know. But accounting leader, for example, right? If you use that example, I think that's a lot more discrete. Like accounting's been around forever. You can get the CPA if you wanted to level up your knowledge. Or, you can, there's different rules like FASB and so forth. That it's like, I mean, there are standards that are set. So gap.
Yeah, I agree. And I almost put in the article, in some ways, I was more qualified to become a CFO than a CDO. In that, had I become I spent 3 years in finance before I moved into data, but had I become a CFO with a reasonable level of confidence, I could say I could have understood the technical specialism of everyone beneath me, and therefore, not in detail, but at a veneer level, and therefore I would have happy being saying I have ultimate accountability. And being able to merge those things together and known the implications to say, okay, the tax person needs to speak to the audit person or whatever. When I became chief data officer, I was very conscious that I didn't have that. And I started reading very avidly about some of the areas that I got gaps in, which, as you say, doesn't mean I filled the gaps, because we haven't really defined what that fundamental knowledge base is that everyone should have. It's really hard to know. So I spent a lot of time on data governance, like you. My career hadn't introduced me to it until I reached chief data officer. But then I became aware of other gaps that I had, and it's very hard to know how to finish them off. And I think we ought to be able to come together as, I was about to use the term professionals, as Astor have said, maybe we're not, as data individuals, and define a foundational framework that ideally everyone could have a common language of. And I know things keep changing and new terms come in, but that happens in the disciplines as well. I mean, lawyers are coping with changes, accountants are coping with changes, medical people are coping with changes. So it's not saying it has to be static, but yeah, it does feel there's something missing.
Yeah, and maybe it's a framework for thinking about data, right? So you're not the first, chief data officer I've talked to that said, yeah, I know I have this title. I'm sometimes a bit. The gaps was a big thing that kept coming up. Like I don't know what I don't know, and then I have my known unknowns. I'm trying to fill it in, but it's like, but the mental models and the framework to think about, how does data in an organization work holistically, right? Like that is not consensus. I'm sure people have written books on this. Actually, I know they have. But again, there's competing opinions on this. And I think to the point of your article and to the point of the discussion, that's the one thing where I do agree. It's about time we start having the discussion in terms of, like, I think identifying what does that look like exactly? Because this is a profession where apparently the new oil or something like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. So what I want to do is, I'm conscious other people have tried, so I'm not arrogant enough to feel that I could go out and define it. What I'm trying to do with this article is start a conversation and get a broad enough group together. I've had a look at some of the frameworks that are out there, and they don't seem to have had that broad input from multiple disciplines to try and so there's some that have gone very much down a computer science lens, data science lens, etc. But I think, and it might need a title. If you look at accounting, there are different accounting frameworks. You've got management accounting, you've got
Yeah.
auditing. So I see a need in particular for a business orientated framework. For example, at Jaguar Land Rover, it wasn't my idea, it was my former boss's idea. We ran business training for the data team. We taught them how to read a simple set of accounts.
Ooh.
And I think that it was invaluable. So if
Yeah.
we're now having all these conversations that data people need to have more accountability for the value of what they do, well, let's give them some training so people understand the difference between cash and profit and and depreciation and what working capital means. Not in depth, but so you can look at a chart of accounts and know what they mean and start to go, this is where the more value ought to come from, because just look how much money's on the balance sheet there.
Right.
That level of intro, I think, should be part of a data profession as well. So, yeah, but it needs a broad group to define it and practitioner led, rather than a lot of these groups are training organization led.
Right. They have an interest in I think,
Yes.
having and selling a framework, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to give you an example, right? I think, a small example in a small area of data, but maybe it might help. Like with fundamentals of data engineering, the book that Matt Housley and I wrote. When we first approached O'Reilly with the idea, they actually didn't think that we should write the book, because they were like, "How
Wow.
are you?" Because you're trying to define a field from first principles. We decided to take a technology agnostic viewpoint and decide, okay, so like if we were to zoom out like 5-10 years from now, right? Like what
Yeah.
would data engineering look like? And more important, like what's not going to change, right? Like what are some of the immutable things from that a practitioner would need to know? The things that we settled on in the book were the result of that thought process. And I got to tell you, it was very difficult because you think it's easy, and you start going through, and you're like, okay, so gosh, security, where does that exist? Well, I guess everywhere. So you should probably know about that, because if you get that wrong, you're kind of
Yeah.
dead. But it was a good thought exercise. I don't know if something like that would help, but the question I had to ask really was like, again, what are the things that aren't going to change? Because things change so often. I would say at a at a noisy level. So the whole job is to figure out what's a signal, beneath all the the clutter and the noise. So might be helpful. I don't know, but
I think it would, and I think a common flaw that a lot of people in data have, myself included, is looking for perfection, and so the answer has to be exactly right. It doesn't. You can include things on the framework. I mean, take data management. To a lot of people, data management isn't actually needed for their role, because for better or for worse, they're working with data sets that it doesn't matter if they've stored it 50 times, they're still not spending much money. So that whole thing about, and it causes chaos, but they're delivering value. So they could argue they didn't need to know data management, but I'd argue you wouldn't have a professional foundation unless you at least knew about the concepts, so that you could make the individual call on an individual project of, actually not materially relevant here, or let's bring in some of those concepts, and when you need to do that. And then you could bring together the pillars, which, I mean, broadly we could probably flush out 80% on a call. I've thought about it before, would be data engineering, data science, basic concept of algorithms, problem structuring, and product management, analytics, visualization, a little bit of business knowledge, and then regulations and ethics. And like, that's going to touch pretty much most things. There'll be some small bits missing for sure. But I don't know any qualification which is actually touching even just what I've mentioned before we've even thought about it in depth, to probably go, okay, maybe you need to understand a little bit about, I don't know, taxonomies or whatever it is.
right.
But I don't know anything that even touches the things that I've just mentioned.
I don't know. I mean, there's.
Yeah.
Go on.
Data ethics is an example. I keep trying to learn more about it, and it's a growing field. And then every now and then I fall across, and I'm really bad with names, so I can't name the person I'm thinking of right now, but I fall across someone who's actually an expert in this, has done it for years, has got a whole load of writing, has got frameworks around it. And you're, I wish that was everywhere. So there's a lot of stuff that's invented from scratch, but there's a lot of good knowledge out there and a lot of expertise to pull upon.
Well, and I think you're hitting on a good point too, because there's a lot of good knowledge out there, but a lot of it's disparate, and a lot of it you don't know until you dive beneath the surface and find it, right? Like I'm working on a new book on data modeling, and I figured I'd be done with this thing by now, but a few things have also happened. Um, but the more I dive into it, the more I'm like, okay, there's a lot more to this particular topic than you know, because I like to go, I like to start from first principles and go deep
Yeah.
on topics, and this is one of them where I'm like, okay, let's go as deep as we can, and the more you go deep, the deeper you get, I guess. But that's like a lot of stuff, and then you start realizing, okay, so what concepts, what practices borrow from other disciplines, right? So lean, for example, that what I'm realizing is that is forming the cornerstone of a lot of practices like DevOps, for example, and other ops, right? And so then you got to go, which I have a background in, thankfully, but it's like you start connecting the dots, right? And because what I realize is the literature that we have written specifically for data is great, but what can you borrow from professions that have already sort of paved the way
Yeah.
for where you want to go? So,
and if I think back to my accounting qualification, there was a module I referred to as the polyfiller module, which was kind of, let's just throw in the things that didn't fit elsewhere. And I was a bit critical of it at the time, but there was a real point in let's just tell people what's out there. And to your point, I find the same thing. I continually come across things which are in-depth, good standards, good concepts, which are just, I think, should be like the fair data principles. Or Dharma, actually. I hadn't heard of Dharma until I became a CDO. And one of I tested on LinkedIn a few times. I've said, what are the data forums out there? What are the organizations which are setting principles from a technical standpoint? And almost every time I answer the question, another one gets thrown in. And sometimes you look at them and I can't find much value in them. Sometimes you look at them and you go, wow, how have I not heard of this before? And there's a whole wealth of knowledge. And yet there's nothing which then pulls them together, or has someone who's starting their career goes, by the way, this is here, and you can pull on these things if you need them.
Oh, for sure.
It doesn't exist. It's
if you go on like a lot of Slack groups or even LinkedIn, people are asking advice all the time, like, how do I get started in, to use an example, again, data modeling or data management, for example, right? And there's like books that have been out for decades on these topics.
Yeah.
And the first thing is like, what, have you read these books? No. Okay, go read the books. Or maybe, but what I also notice is, I don't know what, if it's, and I hate to sound like a curmudgeon, but it's like, I don't know about this generation of data people, but it feels like there's a lot of wheel reinvention going on, where a lot of the old practices just aren't being discovered. I don't know if it's how people search for information now, or how kind of knowledge is transferred within an organization, from person to person or within between companies. But it's interesting because a lot of the I think back in the old days, because there were fewer resources out there, they were sort of known resources, right? So you could pass a book down, and that was the canonical book that everyone agreed to read. Whereas now there's so many resources, it's hard to know where to begin sometimes.
I also think it was simpler in the past because it was a smaller discipline. So
yeah.
By and large, I all things are generalizations, but massive overgeneralization on the way. I think broadly speaking, 20 years ago, data was either largely an IT infrastructure thing and it had its whole domain around that, Dharma's part of that world, or it was the analytics world where they were very different beasts. They didn't need to speak the same language. Analytics largely didn't make products that had to be continued and maintained, so it didn't have to worry about a lot of the concepts that the other one did. The other one had to work on infrastructure, had to work on waterfall. Those two worlds have collided together without any real planning. They've just merged.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So my background was the analytics, and I think that's where a lot of my knowledge gaps come from, is a lot of the infrastructure world, the Dharma world, the TDWs, all of that. I came across like the Kimball data model and stuff, but it was never there in my training. It was
Why would it be? It's like, but then there's collisions of worlds within that, right? You have the TDW, which I consider kind of more traditional data warehousing, and then more kind of new school streaming technologies, cloud for, kind of more modern approaches. And like, these are worlds that collide with each other too all the time. And I think what you're kind of alluding to as well is data is now becoming, there's a term data product that's being thrown around. And I think that there's a lot of weight to this though, right? Where data used to be, as you're saying, more kind of an IT function for reporting and management decisions. And now it's being central to the products itself and the applications. And it's a rule book we've been having to figure out as we kind of go along, because there hasn't really been, I think, consolidated knowledge or practices. So
I think one of the analogies I use is it's almost like data is where software was 20, almost maybe even 30 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. One of the experiences I had that pushed me down this route, we went through org design a bunch of times at JLR, a lot of organizations do, when the software teams and the DevOps teams and IT had their meetings to look at org design changes. A common message was, let's not reinvent the wheel. We know how this works. We know how DevOps works. We know we can choose what type of model approach flavor we're using, but these are the standards. These are the approaches. The data team, only a small exaggeration, but spent half a day arguing about what a data product was. But those same concepts of how we operate just aren't there, but they are there for software, but they weren't 20 years ago. Software was really struggling on how you scale software and code management. So I think it is a maturity thing. Yeah. The question is, how do you accelerate the maturity, the development, and what can we learn from the routes everyone else has been through? And it's where I honestly feel like oversimplification, but it feels from an outsider's perspective. I use Agile, but I'm not like an Agile coach. Agile had its breakthrough moment when a bunch of people went to a hotel in Canada and wrote down some principles.
Oh, it was actually, believe it or not, it was at a hotel just down the street from where I live.
Oh, really? I thought it was Canada. So it was in Utah, was it?
It was it was a Snowbird Resort in Salt Lake, yeah. So,
right.
Yeah, every time I drive up there now, I'm like, instead of looking at the skiing, I'm like, oh, they made the Agile manifesto there, which is funny. Anyway.
Amazing.
I know, yeah. But that was a while ago. That was 2001 or something, right? So
right.
It's a bit ago.
But maybe it's something as simple that's needed in data, just enough practitioners to come together and go, here's a framework, here are some principles. Principles are much better than rules. Rules, you've got to go on to volume after volume after volume. Principles just give you guidance.
Yeah.
And start to say, look, this is how we believe it all nets together. You can go and look at Agile. People have gone and got their own flavors off the back of it. You've got Safe, you've got Scrum, but people all go back to founding principles. But it's got to be done in an unowned, non-profit, for the benefit of the community type way.
I completely agree. You don't want to get co-opted, right? I mean, I'm more than happy to join this initiative if you're interested, and anyone else
please,
the audience, So I think it's something that needs to exist. But you're absolutely right. Maybe it is. Maybe this does start out just as a set of principles, and that's kind of where it goes from there. I mean, and the thing is, you can look back on Agile and see what I think went well for Agile, and also what sort of went sideways, which it certainly did. I mean, there's a lot of kind of Agile cult behavior that resulted in this, but that's bound to happen. That when you give principles, people interpret them different ways, and that's just what happens.
But one of the interesting, and whether it's related at all or not, one of the interesting things that's happened in Agile in the last 5 years is boards have got it. And I don't know whether that's because of some of the standardization that happened or something entirely unrelated. But if you go back 5 years ago, people had heard of it. It was a kooky thing that software teams did, and some other people that were maybe a bit innovative and a bit different. But it's now really common to hear at board level people we're becoming an Agile organization. We want everyone to move over to a new way of working. Data transformations are still not at that level in any way, shape, or form. There's still a lot of disagreement about what they are. The board, they want a data company, but it's not well defined enough for them to know what to say they do next and what that means. So there's a lot I think we can learn from where Agile went.
Oh yeah.
It's
an interesting tidbit today. I was climbing at the gym this morning, and a friend of mine comes by. He's a project manager at this climbing gym, and they've been doing agile for a while. They have
Yeah.
a whole framework set up, and he's just like, yeah, I'm just here to to enforce the process and stuff. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's good. I mean, more power to you, as long as everyone can agree to use it. And but I thought it was it because what the more interesting point is, it's a climbing gym, like a rock climbing gym. It's like,
Yeah.
but they're doing agile. Okay,
What do you need agile for? Yeah. Don't know.
It apparently works for them. They've been doing it for a while, but it's interesting, right? Because you wouldn't think that a company like that would be adopting agile, but the CEO, he's all about it. He's like, yeah, this is what we're doing. So
yeah, it's become more pervasive in that way. It's really interesting, and people talk about small A versus big A, and I think something similar. I actually think there's a lot of similarity between what we describe as being a data-driven organization and agile organization. They're both bottom up, where innovation happens in the weeds. The top gives direction. Agile relies a lot on measurement of what's going on. They're quite related concepts. But yeah, that is interesting. Even the climbing gyms kind of moving across to the agile world. So in terms of as I said, like the article I published yesterday, it's been interesting, the response. I've had a number of people reach out, which is exactly what I wanted, and I'm going to do some more articles and writing just to get people to reach out, to pull a group together and get this to be owned and more people interested in this than just myself. But I was also surprised at people who had quite a strong adverse reaction to this.
It'll happen.
Yeah. More so than other posts, which was, I think there's a fear of rules within data. People like to be able to do their own thing. And professionalization shouldn't be constraining. It should be optional whether you're in it or not. But yeah, it was interesting that there was an adverse reaction as well.
Tell me more.
Very strong opinions of you can't succeed if you want to do this. I'm not trying to do anything to anyone. I'm just suggesting that something should happen. But that you can't do this in data because data is too unbounded. And the response is, well, isn't IT equally broad an area? Isn't law equally broad an area? And there's been professional organizations help to produce some standards in there. So there's a little bit of, I think it's immaturity again, particularly given, some of the changes that are coming in our area. You posted yesterday, 2 days ago, on the EU AI Act.
Yeah, yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah. If you imagine data were a professionalized area, you could quite easily understand how a large number of people working in the area were members of a professional body. They would cascade knowledge on this is how it changes how you do data engineering. It would all cascade and change down. As we get laws coming in on things like how we manage AI without any form of profession, this is going to be hard work, really hard work. It's GDPR and then some.
GDPR was hard enough.
It was.
I remember the day that came into, what was it, 2018, May 20 something or other. But I remember everyone was freaking out at the last second. It was like, oh yeah, there's this GDPR thing coming, and like, yeah, they've been talking about it for a while. It's not new, but and at that time, to give you an idea, it was like, some people were like, I'll just delete everything that's older than 90 days.
So that
was a knee-jerk response. It's like, don't have time to comply, so that's just what I'm going to do. I'm like, what? Oh, okay, I don't know, fine, do it.
Do that if you like. Yeah,
you might be kicking yourself later, but even then, there was a guidance from the law, but there wasn't like a data standards body saying like, here's our official recommendation how you should proceed with this, right? Like when laws happen or rules happen in accounting, I think there's some suggestions on how to proceed. I know in law that tends to standards bodies will come down and say that here's our suggestion for how you should go about this. Yeah. But in data, it was like, I don't know. Everybody had the lawyer looking at the law and interpreting it differently, as far as I could tell. So.
I agree. And as still a member of an accounting body, I practically get spammed whenever there's a change to some accounting legislation. They're so on top of telling you about all of the changes to different things. And the AI legislation, there's so much in there that's subjective. And rightfully so. They've got sandpits where they're going to allow the law to be customized and tailored. if you're trying to get data teams aware of, the levels of unacceptable risk that's defined within the
Right.
act, which goes down to, are you changing an individual's behavior? I mean, I would argue that every social media algorithm changes an individual's behavior. So how we start to get teams to work around this and be aware of the consequences and
Right.
do what the correct way to respond to this is risk management, right? There's a level of ambiguity on things. You flag things on a risk register with an organization. The board chooses what its risk appetite is and whether they want to approve or whether they want to prepare for the possibility of fines, as I'm sure ChatGPT has done. That's a whole change in behaviors to how we work, because a product that's produced that goes to market that an individual is acting with on a regular basis and that is then being customized to that individual has so many ramifications under this law, and there'll be so many different teams that touch that product who maybe don't even know how to collaborate together today. Data science teams and data engineering teams and product managers, nightmare. Unless there's a coherent language between the teams, I think it's just going to end up as a minefield, which, in organizations that didn't necessarily have that smart an approach to GDPR, they have made the friction of doing data work very high.
Oh, yeah.
Because you couldn't rely on individuals, so you had to bring in process. And the same thing could happen here. The alternative is to train individuals. Go on.
And the crux, too, is with software and data teams anymore, I would say, they're becoming more conjoined. I mean, data teams rely on the data from the software teams. And so what's the difference? You model your data maybe perhaps differently when you're creating an ML model or an app, something for analytics, modeling it for that. But at the end of the day, like, you're usually completely dependent upon the data that's upstream from you. So, but often these teams don't talk to each other. And a lot of application developers and software engineers, they don't have the foggiest clue about what quote data people do. It's like, I don't know, they're over there. I just give them data. What they do with it, I don't really care about. So, I mean, that's what I hear often. So, I actually sent a Slack conversation just a bit ago with people. We were talking about, data supply chains and stuff. And these were mostly software engineers. And they're trying to apply the notion of, supply chains and software engineering and so forth and security over to data. And they're like, well, what's the rubric that I need to think about this in? And I'm like, that's a good question. Actually, I don't know. so I don't know.
It's a harder problem, I think. I think we've got a harder job moving the data sector forward than software, because software is largely done by specialist software teams. Mm-hmm. But data is done by a vast number of teams across the business that aren't necessarily specialist data teams, particularly the direction that arguably software is going. You can put together an algorithm and collect a new data set just using a Salesforce GUI. That's arguably a data role that have done that, but it's a lot harder to identify the type of person that's doing that. And would you always even classify them as a data individual and a data team? Maybe not. And this is where it's becoming really, really complex, and actually makes it even more important to start to think around some form of standardized training that can touch GUI-based data workers, because they're there and they're going to be making products which interact with individuals. It's a lot more amorphous. Everyone touches data. I don't think everyone necessarily takes as broad a view as I do, and I might be wrong, but I looked at it that anyone who's a heavy Excel worker is to an extent a data worker.
Oh, they are data workers for sure.
But it's not often regarded that way. If you look at where most CDOs draw the lines on their remit, they never turn around and say they have any responsibility to all of those individuals.
Yeah, and I would say it's a big blind spot. Like, it's sort of like imagining that the Earth is the center of the universe, so to speak, right? And or the notion of dark matter. And I always consider Excel to be the dark matter of the data world. It's just
I love that.
there's what you see in front of you, then it's like all the Excel sheets that actually run the world behind the scenes. I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings, where a company has a data warehouse, they got a data team. At the end of the day, the executives are making decisions off an Excel sheet that may or may not have come from that data warehouse or that data team. Might come from a different system. Yeah.
Yeah, the dark matter analogy, that's brilliant. That's inspired. That explains it a lot about how it works. And it's not going to change, right? It's not going to change.
You know how many companies I've seen people say, "Oh, we're gonna get rid of Excel."
And have you seen any succeed?
No, of course not. I mean, it's still there. It's like, I think by some accounts, like over 2 billion spreadsheet users between Google Sheets, Excel, and so forth. Right? Like if anything, it keeps growing, especially with all the new plugins with like OpenAI and everything. It's like it's only going to keep increasing. I don't see it decreasing. So it's like but then you talk about these topics like data management and governance, and like all that stuff flies out the window the moment you start talking about spreadsheets.
Yeah. And that there's a sense of double standards there. When I got challenged on, so I took quite a strong approach to pushing out technology to the rest of the business, tools like Tableau, and people who said, "Isn't that a risky thing to do?" I was like, "Is it? I've got more management on this than I do on what they're currently using." But because of the blind spot approach, that's always ignored. And when you talk about giving people better access to source systems to use the data, and they say, "Well, you're making the world worse," are you? Or are you just actually being able to monitor what's happening for the first time rather than unmonitored CSVs flying around everywhere? There's definitely a lot of head in the sand.
There's a lot, yeah, because from a technology and vendor management standpoint, right? If you're making these decisions, it's like, okay, I can control this footprint here, but I mean, each one of these products, for example, has an export to Excel functionality, or most of them do.
Yeah.
Right. So in Tableau, for example, like it's like, in any BI tool I've seen, the number of people who are like, "Oh yeah, can you get an Excel version of that?" That's a super common question. It's I just stopped having an opinion on it. It is what it is. I don't know.
And have you ever met anyone in any organization that says, "I'm responsible for Excel usage"? I mean, normal IT applications, someone says, "I'm responsible for Salesforce," but Excel?
Well, I mean, you might be responsible for the licenses behind, say, Office or something.
Yes,
like I'm not responsible for the usage of it. That's on the user. So, and the thing is, there's no training, right? You go to a lot of companies. It's like, how often have you seen spreadsheet training? Like, here's how you use Excel.
I used to give spreadsheet training. It had the longest waiting list when I was at KPMG. Yeah, I wasn't me who set it up. Someone else set it up, but because someone set up some good spreadsheet training, cool. Lots of us got involved in delivering it, because for the first time, the productivity, the feedback was incredible. People said, I went on this one-day course and my productivity's gone up 20-30%. And
that's awesome.
Yeah. But why it's not more common, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because everyone, when a lot of job descriptions like must have proficiency in Microsoft Office Suite or something like that. Like, I don't know what that means. It's like a bunch of products. But yeah, and there's, if you go on for days about the Excel, it's just like this. Like I said, it's its own universe, really. And it's like a parallel universe, that kind of exists alongside the quote data universe. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Be interesting how that evolves with all of the applications that are coming onto it. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like I said, happy to collaborate on this this idea of yours. I think it's super cool. So yeah, I'll
definitely follow up on that. And likewise, anyone who's listening, go check out the Substack. It's datent.com, and my contact points are there. So if you're interested, let me know, and we'll get a group together and start to move this forward.
Yeah, anything we can do to help make this better is a worthy cause. So, well, Benny, it's been fun chatting with you. For people who want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
On LinkedIn, look for Benny Benford, or I've got my Substack, which is datent.com. Stands for
it's a really
data
good
intent.
Substack too, and great LinkedIn posts. I think that's how we found each other. I was like, this guy, he's got good ideas, and he's opinionated. I like this. So it wasn't
Thanks.
It was some spicy takes, which I like. And so, just you have an opinion and you're sticking with it. So it's awesome. So everyone go check out his LinkedIn. So awesome. Well, I hope you have a great day. So
you too. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, you.